Warren, the common concept of religious people are that we are body and soul, and the soul is a very important part of religious belief, its immortality and what happens to it. And the assumption is that this comes straight from the Bible. I want to ask you to give me the history of the concept of a soul, both biblical and extra biblical, so we can begin at least to see this critical question in some sort of a historical context.
Yes, if you don't mind getting a little philosophical history of philosophy and history of biblical studies from a neuroscientist. As I understand it, that the body-soul dualism largely comes from Platonic philosophy, from the philosophy of Plato. So you have the world of the forms, and then you have the world of the material world, and we're here in the material world, but the real world is a world of forms. Well, if you impose that on people, then the physical person there that's you isn't the real you. The real you must be there in the world of forms. So we get this dualism of the real person and then the physical person. And that worldview was influential in the Greco-Roman world, which biblical interpretation in the early church was influenced by that view, in which case then there began to be read back into scriptures as they had recently been written at that time, a view that what was being talked about was a body and a soul, and even back into the Old Testament. What current biblical theologians are saying was, if you look back at the language and the culture and whatever, at least certainly in the Old Testament, there really isn't any distinction, any breakup of the person into two parts like a body and soul. And that in the New Testament, you have to read it in, that there are language that Paul uses that may be read that way if you already presume that to be the nature of persons. But if you don't already presume that to be the nature of the person from some other philosophical commitment, then it's very difficult to find its way. And then a lot of Christian thought was influenced by St. Augustine. And St. Augustine was definitely a follower of Plato. And so he gave us a mixture of Christian theology and Platonic philosophy. And one of the things that Augustine did for us, good or bad, was give us a reflexive idea of looking inward to the soul. The soul lives inside of us, and where our spiritual life occurs is in some separate part that somehow lives inside. And so we get a reflexiveness and an inwardness and an individuality. That is, the soul is my soul and it's inside. So I am me and everything important about me is inside me. That becomes even stronger with the work of Rene Descartes. And Descartes wanted to be a physicalist. He thought all of the body was physical, but the only thing Descartes could not figure out was how it was rationality to come out of physiology. And so he said, well, we have to have one soul, the rational soul, because the physical system can't be rational. Well, I really think if Descartes had been doing his philosophy in modern neuroscience, how the brain can be rational would be fairly obvious, and he might not have even been a dualist himself. But we get a very strong separation of mind or soul and body in the work of Descartes, and that's kind of moved forward into modern philosophy. One other thing back in the early church times was a heresy that the church was worried about called Gnosticism, which was really a kind of strong body-soul dualism, where the body was bad, the soul was good. One had to gain spiritual knowledge of the world that is non-physical, kind of a desire to depart from the physical world. And that kind of Gnosticism, even though there was good work against it in early Christian times, has kind of re-permeated the church at various times, to where writers talking about the church now have suggested that the modern Christian church is basically Gnostic, that this deep commitment to body-soul dualism is still present in a way. And so the question really to be sorted out is, was this really a Platonic overlay on a Bible that was not written out of that point of view, and a development in the teachings of Christ, for example, that weren't meant to imply that kind of dualism? Or is that in fact there, and we should bring it into our modern understandings of Christian religion and religion?
So what's clear is, though, at the present time, the vast majority of the Christian world are dualist in orientation. Any surveys show that 80-90% of people believe in a soul, an immortal soul, and different characteristics of it. So this tradition has come forward. And so in this progression of the history of ideas, how then does neuroscience and your work begin to affect it?
I often say, in talking about neuroscience versus questions of soul, that in current modern neurophysiology, it's hard to figure out what the soul would do that we don't know the brain systems involved in. So if there's nothing kind of left over that the soul would account for, and if body-soul dualism is not a certain implication
from Scripture,
from the Bible,
if that's what you believe,
then might we want to be physicalist, or at least non-reductive physicalist, in the sense that we understand persons to be bodies, persons but bodies, souls. We are souls, we don't have a soul.
Well, what does that mean?
If I'm going to use the word soul, I'm going to talk about me as a whole person. I'm not going to talk about a part of me that is non-physical.
But your soul, quote unquote, is totally physical.
Yeah, it's me as a physical person.
Right. So I wouldn't even use the word soul.
Yeah,
I'd make up a new word.
We'll use the word person.
Yeah.
And in fact, a lot of what is happening in modern translations of the Bible is this realization is causing retranslation. So in where the King James might have used the word soul, the modern translations use the word person, or them, or he or she, or...
Well, person is a neutral term.
Yeah.
It doesn't imply physical or non-physical. It's a very neutral term. Well, soul is a very definite connotation.
As it is used now, definitely, right. is used to mean... I often say we are souls, we don't have a soul, that a soul is a designation of a whole physical person, or we are bodies, we don't have bodies, that we aren't souls that own a body, but we are bodies.